A cleaning lady found me with my dad's corpse a couple of hours after I had my fun with him. After I murdered him. I could have killed her. But what little conscience I had left stopped me from doing it. I didn't say a word as the police slapped the cuffs on me and shoved me out of the bloodied hotel room. I was silent again when they roughly shoved me into the police cruiser and when they began driving me off towards the station. Better call that voodoo freak. He's got a lot of explaining to do on this one. The cop driving said. Driving me towards the station, I looked up at them from behind the cage that separated me from them. I pushed my face close to the cage to try and listen to their conversation. It's getting harder to do whatever he says. Especially after the whole shop burned down. He's got us turned up to 11 covering for all his shit. The man mumbled, sighing as he stopped at a red light and looked back at me. Flinching when he saw how close I was staring at him. He soon elbowed the cage hard and sent me back into the seat. Rubbing my nose, I stared in silence as they continued driving after the red light. Isn't this his clerk? Or cashier, or whatever? The other cop asked, turning to look at me with a disgusted look. I stared back with my button eyes and just stared at him. Eventually winning as he turned and looked straight ahead. How should I know? That freak never informs us of anything. The lead cop said, driving off towards the station. He looked at me through the rearview mirror and kept a watchful eye on me the whole drive there. Making sure to keep quiet about King Creole around me. I sighed as we finally arrived at the station and I was pulled out of the back seat and into the station. Having all those cops eye me as I was pushed into a solo cell was uncomfortable, to say the least. I sat down on the cold bench of the holding cell and stared at the ceiling light as I took in the gravity of what I had just done. I killed my mother. I killed my father. And while inside I was tearing myself apart with grief. But, aside from some thoughts of that, I didn't feel anything other than a sense of pride. At least with my dad's death, I was able to have more fun with it. Hey, freak. The cop you brought me here said, banging on the bars with his nightstick. Bringing my attention from the ceiling over to him. I stared at him for a while. I would normally answer him, but I really didn't have anything I wanted to tell him. Your boss is here. He snuffed, stepping aside as a familiar face and top hat came into my view. I sat up straighter when he did and stood up all the way when he came to a stop in front of my cell. Travis. You've been a very naughty boy. He scat me, looking at me in the cell and looking at the bars. Tapping the metal rods with his cane with that smile of his. I looked at him and then looked at the floor in disgrace. I'm sorry, sir. I said on my own volition. The first words I'd spoken since carving my father up into pieces. He seemingly relished in those words and stared at me through those bars. He was eating up the side of me, no longer trying to fight him. I heard from this nice officer that you made a very big mess in a hotel room. He said with a chuckle. The cop rolled his eyes. He did more than make a mess. This psycho of yours completely destroyed his dad like he was a fucking fish. He shot at Creole, grabbing him by the back of the collar and pulling the Voodoo King back from my cell. I swallowed hard as I backed away from what I was dreading was about to happen. Son. I'll ask you to kindly let go of me. Creole said, clearly annoyed at this officer for laying a hand on him. The officer, however, clearly didn't take the hint. Pulling him away from me and shoving him into looking at him. Listen here. Your little deal with the department is quickly showing itself to be lopsided in your favor. The only crime that gets committed here is by you. He shoved his finger into Creole's chest. He looked down at it and then up at the officer's face. Sighing as he grabbed the man's hand and yanked it right off its wrist. It was like his hand was a glove and had been easily ripped off. He stared in disbelief for a moment and then began screaming as blood began spilling out of his stump. Creole didn't give him long to anguish as he quickly shoved the man away and grabbed his ring of keys as he tumbled down and fell to the floor with a loud thud. Dead from, I assume, shock. Fast-acting shock. Seems you don't have a family anymore, Travis. He said with hum. Opening up my cell and walking in. Dropping the keys and tapping his cane on the cold stone floors. I looked at the floor in disgrace once again as he approached me and gripped me by the shoulders. I said with a soft mumble. He looked at me with a smile and pushed my chin up to meet his button eyes. My time's up, isn't it? I asked him. To which he nodded with a wide smile and a tussle of my hair. Afraid so. Not like you have anywhere to go anyway. And I need my clerk back for the grand reopening. He patted me on the head and turned to leave, waiting at the door for me. I looked at him, and then at the cage I was being forced to choose between. An eternity of prison with him. Or an eternity of prison behind bars. Reluctantly I chose him. Walking over to him, and keeping my head down as he led me out of the station. Creole. An old grumbly voice came. Causing him to stop and turn to look at the owner of the voice. I followed suit, seeing an elderly cop with a white mustache and receding hairline coming over to us. Creole gave a slight giggle as he waved to the man. "Captain. How are you, sir? Is there something I can help you with?" Creole asked him, leaning onto his cane with a smile as he waited for an answer. The man stopped in his tracks when he laid eyes on Creole. He gulped, and any courage he seemingly had was quickly wiped away. "You killed another officer. Did he give you some kind of trouble?" the man asked, clearly on the defense as Creole seemingly had some kind of sway over him. Creole tapped his chin and thought, as if the fact he had killed a police officer had completely slipped his mind. "Oh yes. He was very rude to me and my employee. Saying things like our deal with each other was only benefiting me. Can you believe such nonsense?" Creole cackled, slapping me on the back as he laughed. I stumbled forward a bit and offered my boss a little courtesy chuckle as well. The captain meanwhile was seemingly about to faint at how badly he was sweating. "We would never think that, sir," the captain quickly assured, swallowing hard and leading us over to the front desk. Pulling out my record and handing it over to Creole. He marveled at it and handed it at me to see. Looking at my old self was like looking at a complete stranger. I didn't know who the person looking back at me was. And I don't think he even knows who I am. "Thank you for all your help, Captain." Creole tipped his hat and led me out of the police station. Once we were outside, he yanked a sheet from me and tore it up into pieces in front of me. Another piece of me was destroyed, and I was left with just him now. "What happens now, sir?" I asked timidly. He looked at me with a raised brow and chuckled like I was an idiot. "Maybe I am one. We go back to the shop, of course. After all, you and Mama need to learn to get along together. Plus your punishment still isn't over yet. Just because you killed your daddy doesn't mean you get rid of what you did." He hummed, grabbing me by the hair and pulling me close. Shoving the head of the cane into my face. "Besides, I'd like to meet this new Travis. The one who wants me to call him a good boy," he mused. I swallowed hard, forgetting I had written that during the murder of my dad. I kept silent, which didn't make Creole happy as his smile wavered and he beat me on the head with his cane. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me off as he forced me to walk off towards the end of town, where the shop is located. I received several strikes and hits from him, but I finally arrived at the shop. Seeing that it was nearing completion. "Amazing what a couple of hands can do, isn't it?" he asked with a chuckle as he leaned on my shoulder and waved his hand at everything that had been done to fix the once burned down Voodoo shop. It was like visiting the site of a horrible accident that had scarred you for life. And I was forced to be back here once again. "Yes, sir. Amazing," I answered back to him submissively. He smiled and ushered me into the shop. It was pretty much exactly the same. Down to the dusty counter and the wall of Voodoo dolls. No telling where all those had come from. My main guess was they were all the old ones, just shoved back into a Voodoo doll. "Is that you, Charles?" a voice came from the office. Creole's mother poked her head out there. And upon seeing me, she instantly stared daggers at me and exited from the office. A Voodoo doll in her hands as she continued to sew. Seems she taught Creole that as well. "Why on earth did you bring him back here?" she snuffed, obviously not liking me. I share her sentiment. "He's my pet, Mama. Besides, who else is going to be the clerk?" He slapped me on the back, sending me stumbling into the strings which had been dangling from the ceiling, seemingly waiting for my inevitable return. This time I didn't bother fighting it. What was even the point? I had nothing left I was willing to fight for. "He'll bring us nothing but trouble, Charles." Mama Creole scolded, coming over to me and grabbing my face roughly. Digging her nails into my cheeks and examining every inch of my face. Apparently, she didn't like what she saw, since she pulled away with a disgusted look on her face. "He's defective," she declared. "Well, I already knew that," Creole said with a chuckle, coming over to his mother's side and looking at me like I was a display sign. He smiled his stupid little smile as he looked at me, seemingly waiting for me to do something. And that something was brought to him when the door behind me opened and a familiar chime of the bell rang. I spun on my heels and looked at the person who had suddenly come into the shop. She was a teenager. Probably just starting her senior year. She visibly recoiled when she saw me, and I didn't make the situation better by stepping forward to her, causing her to back up and seemingly trying to find the door to get the hell out of there. "Welcome," I sang. On my own without string influence. She looked at me with a good amount of fear and confusion in her eyes. "Unfortunately, we are still not open yet. If you like, I can keep your order on hold until our grand reopening," I said with a smile as she looked around the shop and then back at the sign. Seeing clearly that we weren't open yet. No. I was just looking for a job," she asked, handing me a flyer. I stared at the flyer, grabbing it and looking over to Creole with anger in my buttons. He waved at me with a chuckle. He was trying to replace me. He was trying to get rid of me. I crumpled up the flyer and turned back to look at the girl with a big smile. "Ah, I see. Come right this way," I said, taking her past Creole and his mother, who both said nothing as they watched me with interest. I led the girl over to the counter and bent down behind it, smiling to myself when I found exactly what I was looking for. I reached out and grabbed a pair of scissors. Reappearing from behind the counter, I stabbed her hand into the counter with a hard smash. She screamed loudly as she looked at the scissors sticking out of her hand. She pulled on them to try and get away. I smiled as I watched her struggle to try and get away from me. She really was so pathetic, even trying to pry her hand off of the counter. I grabbed her by the hair and stared into her terrified eyes. The old me would have been terrified to see what I was doing to this poor girl. But she was after my job, and this is all I have in the end. Isn't it? "You fucking freak. Let go of me," she screamed and begged, trying with all her frail might to pull herself free. Well, I certainly helped her, of course. I pulled the scissors out of her hand and drove it into her temple. That certainly shut that naughty mouth of hers right up. She flopped to the floor in silence as she finally shut up. I looked over to Creole for any kind of praise. He smiled at me and clapped happily. His mother was still staring with disapproval at me. There is still no pleasing that woman. Creole walked over to me and looked at the body that was wriggling on the floor. He smiled with a sense of pride as he looked at me. "You're a good boy," he said with a soft coo, as if finally giving me something that he was holding out on for so long. And I offered him another smile back, but that was quickly wiped off my face when he raised his hand and slapped me across the face, sending me spiraling into the wall next to me. I held my cheek and looked up at him in terror. "But I'm a good boy," I whimpered out pathetically. He looked over the counter at me with a raised brow and chuckled happily. Coming over behind the counter and grabbing me by my bloodied hoodie, he stared into my button eyes and I shuddered back. "So, you still must be punished for your past sins. Nobody goes unpunished, Travis. Nobody," he said softly, patting me on the spot where he'd smacked me, before gut punching me and causing me to dry heave. "No telling when the last I ate was. You're my new Mary," he said with a yellow toothy grin. "Except you're more useful than that whore was." He chuckled, pulling me to my feet by the strings and forcing me to stand in place. "Charles, stop playing with your defective pet and get rid of that body. No point in letting precious materials go to waste." Mama Creole spoke up, to which Charles nodded and walked over to the dead girl, grabbing her by the legs and pulling her away towards the basement. I guess business was starting back up again after all. Once Creole was down in the basement, Mama Creole walked over to me and got a good look at me, touching my face before finally letting out a long exasperated sigh. Suddenly she looked a lot older than she normally looked. Not like when she was a rotting corpse, but old enough to bring my attention to it. "It looks like you were right. He's not the same son I once had," she sighed, looking towards her basement. The trail of blood soon disappeared as we looked at it. "All those years without me must have corrupted him. Just like your lack of sleep has done to you," she sighed, rubbing her face into her hands and just shaking her head. "Why? Does Baron Samedi have a deal with you?" I gathered the courage to ask, expecting to be hit or something by the woman. But she just looked at me with a sad chuckle. "It's a very long story. A mother in sheer grief begging Allah to save her baby boy. I wouldn't expect you to understand. She scoffed, turning to me, and stared again with her disapproving eyes. I said nothing to her as she went off and entered the office. I stayed at my counter until King Creole returned, happily singing to himself as he walked past me, over to the front door and turned the closed sign to open. "Travis, my dear boy. I do believe it's time for our grand reopening," he exclaimed with glee, clapping his hands and practically jumping up and down with excitement. He really was just like a giant child whenever he got excited. But when he was angry it was like a demon itself was hitting me. Over and over again. "Sir, should I change?" I said, looking down at my bloody clothes. He looked over at me and smacked his forehead. He'd completely forgotten. He came walking over to me and took me by the shoulder, nodding and pointing to the basement door. I nodded obediently and walked over to the basement door. Opening it up, I was soon kicked in the back and sent tumbling all the way down to the bottom. Creole's cackling followed me down all the way to the basement. I pushed myself up and looked around, finding a clean change of clothes on the table before me. Changing back into my suit, I made my way back up to the top floor. I was worrying that I would be locked down there like Mary. But the door was open and Creole was standing there waiting for me, a smile on his face as he stepped out of my way so I could take my place at the counter. I sighed as I stood behind it, staring at the empty spot where Tempe once was. I really was all alone this time. All my plans crumbled around me. And now I'm stuck here. Welcome back to all King Creoles, everyone. I do hope you'll stay a while. Please. Stay.